Part 5, Chapter 10. Behind the wire, the ground is burning. No, the surprising thing is not that mutinies and risings did not occur in the camps, but that in spite of everything, they did. Like all embarrassing events in our history, which means 3/4 of what really happened, these mutinies have been neatly cut out, and the gap hidden with an invisible join. Those who took part in them have been destroyed, and even remote witnesses frightened into silence. The reports of those who suppressed them have been burned or hidden in safes within safes within safes, so that the risings have already become a myth, although some of them happened only 15 and others only 10 years ago. No wonder some say that there was no Christ, no Buddha, no Muhammad. There you're dealing in thousands of years. When it can no longer disturb any living person, historians will be given access to what is left of the documents. Archaeologists will do a little digging, heat something in a laboratory, and the dates, locations, contours of these risings, with the names of their leaders, will come to light. Perhaps no, not we ourselves, shall learn at the same time about the legendary rising in 1948 at Public Works Site number 501, where the Sevilla-Masca-Salicards Railway was under construction. It was legendary because everybody in the camps talked about it in whispers, but no one really knew anything. Legendary also because it broke out not in the special camp system, where the mood and the grounds for it by now existed, but in a corrective labor camp, where people were isolated from each other by fear of informers and trampled underfoot by thieves, where even their right to be politicals was spat upon, and where a prison mutiny therefore seemed inconceivable. According to the rumors, it was all the work of ex-soldiers, recent ex-soldiers. It could not have been otherwise. Without them, the 58s lacked stamina, spirit, and leadership. But these young men, hardly any of them over 30, were officers and enlisted men from our fighting armies, or their fellows who had been prisoners of war. These young men still retained in 1948 their wartime elan and believed in themselves, and they could not accept the idea that men like themselves, whole battalions of them, should meekly die. Even escape seemed to them a contemptible half-measure, rather like deserting one by one instead of facing the enemy together. It was all planned and begun in one particular team. An ex-colonel called Voronin or Voronov, a one-eyed man, is said to have been the leader. A first lieutenant of armored troops, Sakharenko, is also mentioned. The team killed their convoy guards. Then they went and freed a second team, and a third. They attacked the convoy guards' hamlet, then the camp from outside, removed the sentries from the towers, and opened up the camp area. Arming themselves with weapons taken from the guards, the rebels went on to capture the neighboring camp division. With their combined forces, they decided to advance on Vorkuta. It was only 60 kilometers away, but this was not to be. Parachute troops were dropped in to bar their way. Then low-flying fighter planes raked them with machine gun fire and dispersed them. They were tried, more of them were shot, and others given 25 or 10 years. At the same time, many of those who had not joined in the operation but remained in the camp had their sentences refreshed. The hopelessness of this rising as a military operation is obvious, but would you say that dying quietly by inches was more hopeful? Riddle. What is the quickest thing in the world? Answer. Thought. It is and it isn't. It can be slow, too. Oh, how slow. Only slowly and laboriously do men, people, society, realize what has happened to them, realize the truth about their position. In herding the 58s into special camps, Stalin was exerting his strength mainly for his own amusement. He had already had them as securely confined as they could be, but he thought he would be craftier than ever and improve on his best. He thought he knew how to make it still more frightening. The results were quite the opposite. The whole system of oppression elaborated in his reign was based on keeping malcontents apart, preventing them from reading each other's eyes, and discovering how many of them there were, instilling it into all of them, even into the most dissatisfied, that no one was dissatisfied except a few doomed individuals, blindly vicious and spiritually bankrupt. In the special camps, however, there were malcontents by the thousands. They knew their numerical strength, and they realized that they were not spiritual paupers, that they had a nobler conception of what life should be than their jailers, than their betrayers, than the theorists who try to explain why they must rot in camps. The old camp mentality, you die first, I'll wait a bit, there is no justice, so forget it, that's the way it was and that's the way it will be, also began to disappear. A bold thought, a desperate thought, a thought to raise a man up. How could things be changed so that instead of us running from them, they would run from us? Once the question was put, once a certain number of people had thought of it and put it into words, and a certain number had listened to them, the age of escapes was over. The age of rebellion had begun. Suddenly, a suicide. In the disciplinary barracks, hut number 2, a man was found hanging. I am going through the stages of the process as they occurred in Ibicustas. But note that the stages were just the same in other special camps. The bosses were not greatly upset. They cut him down and wheeled him off to the scrap heap. A rumor went around the work team. The man was an informer. He hadn't hanged himself. He had been hanged. A lesson to the rest. Kill the Stooly. That was it. The vital link. A knife in the heart of the Stooly. Make knives and cut Stooly's throats. That was it. Now, as I write this chapter, rows of humane books frown down at me from the walls, the tarnished gilt on their well-worn spines glinting reproachfully like stars through cloud. Nothing in the world should be sought through violence. By taking up the sword, the knife, the rifle, we quickly put ourselves on the level of our tormentors and persecutors, and there will be no end to it. There will be no end. Here at my warm desk, in a warm place, I agree completely. If you ever get 25 years for nothing, if you find yourself wearing 4 number patches on your clothes, holding your hands permanently behind your back, submitting to searches morning and evening, working until you are utterly exhausted, dragged into the cooler when someone denounces you, trodden deeper and deeper into the ground, from the hole you're in, the fine words of the great humanists will sound like chatter of the well-fed and free. The oppressed, at least, concluded that evil cannot be cast out by good. Murders now followed one another in quicker succession than escapes in the best period. They were carried out confidently and anonymously. No one went in with a blood-stained knife to give himself up. They saved themselves and their knives for another deed. At their favorite time, when a single warder was unlocking huts one after another, and while nearly all the prisoners were still sleeping, the masked avengers entered a particular section, went up to a particular bunk, and unhesitatingly killed the traitor, who might be awake and howling in terror, or might be still asleep. When they had made sure that he was dead, they walked swiftly away. They wore masks, and their numbers could not be seen. They were either picked off or covered. But if the victim's neighbors should recognize them by their general appearance, so far from hurrying to volunteer information, they would not now give in, even under interrogation, even under threat from the godfathers, but would repeat over and over again, No, I don't know anything. I didn't see anything." And this was not simply in recognition of a hoary truth known to all the oppressed. What you don't know can't hurt you. It was self-preservation, because anyone who gave names would have been killed next 5 a.m., and the security officer's goodwill would have been no help to him at all. And so murder, although as yet there had been fewer than a dozen, became the rule, became a normal occurrence. Anybody been killed today? Prisoners would ask each other when they went out to wash or collect their morning rations. In this cruel sport, the prisoner's ear heard the subterranean gong of justice. Out of 5,000 men, about a dozen were killed. But with every stroke of the knife, more and more of the clinging, twining tentacles fell away. A remarkable fresh breeze was blowing. On the surface, we prisoners living in a camp just as before, but in reality, we had become free. Free because for the very first time in our lives, we had started saying openly and aloud all that we thought. No one who has not experienced this transition can imagine what it is like. An invisible balance hung in the air. In one of its scales, all the familiar phantoms were heaped. Interrogation officers, punches, beatings, sleepless standing, boxes, cells too small to sit or lie down in, cold, damp punishment cells, rats, bedbugs, tribunals, second and third sentences. But this could not all happen at once. This was a slow grinding bone mill. It could not devour all of us at once and process us in a single day. And even when they had been through it, as every one of us had, men still went on existing. While in the other scale lay nothing but a single knife. But that knife was meant for you, if you gave in. It was meant for you alone, in the breast, and not sometime or other, but at dawn tomorrow, and all the forces of the Cheka MGB could not save you from it. It was not a long one, but just right for neat insertion between your ribs. It didn't even have a proper handle, just a piece of old insulation tape wound around the blunt end of the blade. But this gave a very good grip, so that the knife would not slip out of hand. And this bracing threat weighed heavier, so that now the bosses were suddenly blind and deaf. The information machine on which alone the fame of the omnipotent and omniscient organs had been based in decades past had broken down. Foremen started escaping into the disciplinary barracks, hiding behind stone walls. Not only they, but blood-sucking work assigners, stoolies on the brink of exposure, or, something told them, next on the list, suddenly took fright and ran for it. This was a new period, a heady and spine-tingling period in the life of the special camp. It wasn't we who had taken to our heels. They had, ridding us of their presence. A time such as we had never experienced or thought possible on this earth, when a man with an unclean conscience could not go quietly to bed. Retribution was at hand, not in the next world, not before the court of history, but retribution live and palpable, raising a knife over you in the light of dawn. It was like a fairy tale. The ground is soft and warm under the feet of honest men, but under the feet of traitors it prickles and burns. The masters of our bodies and souls were particularly anxious not to admit that our movement was political in character. In their menacing orders, warders went around the huts reading them out, the new trend was declared to be nothing but gangsterism. This made it all simpler, more comprehensible, somehow cozier. It seemed only yesterday that they had sent us gangsters labeled politicals. Well, politicals, real politicals for the first time, had now become gangsters. It was announced, not very confidently, that these gangsters would soon be discovered. So far not one of them had been. And still less confidently, that they would be shot. The orders further appealed to the prisoner mass to condemn the gangsters and struggle against them. The prisoners listened and went away chuckling. Seeing the disciplinary officers afraid to call political behavior by its name, we were aware of their weakness. The orders were of no avail. The prisoner masses did not start condemning and struggling on behalf of their masters. The next measure was to put the whole camp on a punitive routine. The object of the camp administration was to make things so hard for us that we would betray the murderers out of exasperation. But we braced ourselves to suffer, to hang on a bit. It was worth it. Their other object was to keep the huts closed so that murderers could not come from outside, and so would be easier to find. But another murder took place, and still no one was caught, just as no one had ever seen anything or knew anything. Then somebody's head was smashed in at work. Locked huts are no safeguard against that. They revoked the punitive regime. Instead, they had the bright idea of building the Great Wall of China. This was a wall 2 bricks thick and 4 meters high to cut across the width of the camp. They were preparing to divide the camp into 2 parts. We greatly resented that wall. We knew that the bosses had some dirty trick in store, but we had no choice but to build it. Only a little of us was as yet free, in our heads and our mouths, but we were still stuck up to our shoulders in the quagmire of slavery. 2 warders came into a hut after work and casually told a man, "Get ready and come with us." The prisoner looked around at the other lads and said, "I'm not going." In fact, this simple everyday situation, a snatch and a rest, which we had never resisted, which we were used to accepting fatalistically, held another possibility, that of saying, "I'm not going." Our liberated heads understood that now. The warders pounced on him. "What do you mean, not going?" "I'm just not going," the Zek answered firmly. "I'm all right where I am." There were shouts from all around. "Where's he supposed to go? What's he got to go for? We won't let you take him. We won't let you. Go away." And the wolves understood that we were not the sheep we used to be, that if they wanted to grab one of us now, they would have to use trickery, or do it at the guardhouse, or send a whole detail to take one prisoner. With a crowd around, they would never take him. Purged of human filth, delivered from spies and eavesdroppers, we looked about and saw, wide-eyed, that we were thousands, that we were politicals, that we could resist. We had chosen well. The chain would snap if we tugged at this link. The Stoolies, the tale-bearers and traitors. Our own kind had made our lives impossible. As on some ancient sacrificial altar, their blood had been shed that we might be freed from this curse that hung over us. The revolution was gathering strength. The wind that seemed to have subsided had sprung up again in a hurricane to fill our eager lungs. End of Part 5, Chapter 10.